stands for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It was founded in 1915. It's one of the oldest feminist organizations, and it is a membership-based feminist peace-building organization, and it has presence and impact around the world. I am based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm originally from Mexico, and I've been a member since 2018. So the Young WILPF Network specifically is made up of WILPF members who are below the age of 35. And recently, our group has been reflecting a lot about how feminist peace isn't just about policies or statements or multilateral negotiations, but it's actually rooted in our everyday lives. So things from like hiking or even joining a local running club. And so today we really wanted to talk about how sports and even outdoor activities in general can be a powerful expression of feminist peace and also care, collaboration, gender equality, and community building. And so today we have two fantastic guests and speakers. Sarah Murrah has spent her 25-year career at the intersection of gender justice, sport, and play. She has worked in over 70 countries on advancing feminist objectives with this strategy. And Sarah is currently the executive director of Free to Run, an international nonprofit, non-government organization, NGO, using running as an act of feminist resistance globally, with a focus on countries with the lowest gender equity profiles, so Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Palestine. And our second speaker, Nicole Matuska, is the girls director at Women Win. She has been working with Women Win in various capacities since 2011 on a range of different projects and programs in the US and globally. And Nicole has currently taken on the strategic lead of girls' rights through a sports initiative at Women Win, working with implementing partners and other stakeholders across the development, sports, and women's rights sectors to advance the playing field that empowers adolescent girls and young women to exercise their rights through sports and play. So for our first question, it's for Sarah. And Sarah, could you please tell us a little bit more about what sports mean to you personally, and what are some of the most valuable lessons you've learned since you joined Free to Run?
Sure. Thanks, Danny and Emily. Really appreciate you having me on today. And thanks to everyone for joining. It's nice to see you all. Definitely see some old friends in the crowd and hopefully making some new ones today. So what a fun question to start with. What does sports mean to me personally? I'm an athlete. I'm 49. I have two kids, and I consider myself an athlete, and I have since I was probably 5 years old. Sports is really, it's fundamental to my sense of joy, to my mental health, to my physical health, to my sense of resilience. So, in the ups and downs of my adolescence, my upbringing, all of the things that go on in 49 years of living life, sports has been, and physical activity in sports I use synonymously, has been a reprieve for me and a place where I know I can kind of go back to find strength, to find solidarity with people, to find healing, to find meaning. Yeah, it's been for my own human development and my own sense of self. It's been really important, I think. Yeah, and I want to also touch on my gender identity because I think that that's an important sport has been really important in forming my sense of who I am and where I belong. So as a kind of, somewhat androgynous, sporty spice little being when I was young, I couldn't there was a lot I grew up in a lot in rural Vermont, and there were not girls sports teams at that time in the mid 80s and early 90s. It was a bit harder to find, and so I played soccer or football with the boys team, and in like I'm thinking about sixth grade in particular, so right at that cusp of kind of dating and bodies changing and all of the beautiful adolescent experience, and I was in a boys space. And I was good enough because I had lived in some other states with some other good, sport coaching that I could keep up with boys in that sense. And so there was this early understanding for me that I could be where men are and where boys are, and that was possible for me. And so that was a big opening, and I think it was a differentiating factor with some of my other peers who were girls. Or boys and what was available for them. I started snowboarding in the I guess it was the mid 80s. And no girls were doing that. And so as you know, I kind of I turned into this like little snowboard, just, can be with the boys, can do rad stuff. And that was my identity. That was important to me and my rebellion and so on one hand, I think it allowed me to be part of what is boys and men's space early on. And at the same time, when I got to high school and later junior high, and I could be on girls' teams, I found other people like me. And so I could really connect with them and have support. And given some of the trials of adolescence and mine in particular, those friendships and those connections were lifeblood for me, really. And that has continued throughout my life. So I think it both created a sense of likeness and a sense of kind of where I can be. So yeah, sports is my job. This is what I do. I like the fact that I could wake up this morning and have a conversation with this group of people about this topic. And this is what I do for a living for 25 years has always amazed me. It just feels like such a gift and a privilege. So yeah, sports is pretty important to me, I'd say. And then what valuable lessons have I learned? So that was your second question since joining Free to Run. Wow, so much learning in the past 3 years. Free to Run, I joined, yeah, in 2022. And, Free to Run works in some of the places in the world where it's least likely to find girls playing sports, and some of the hardest places for girls to grow up. And I say girls, and I also am not going to all the time today qualify like non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, queer kids, but often the discrimination that happens when we talk about gender and this group knows this, is expansive in terms of folks with marginalized gender identity. So just wanted to kind of point that out. So what did I learn? I think like kind of, I mean, so much, but I'm gonna boil it down to kind of two main lessons. So the first one is that like sports for girls and women is actually possible everywhere and it's needed everywhere. So I intentionally, having worked with Nicole at Women Win, I worked first for 10 years nationally in the US and then internationally for 10 years. And then I started running direct service organizations, smaller grassroots nonprofits that were doing this kind of work. And, there's some places in the world where it's a lot easier to do this. It's, in East Africa, in Kenya or Uganda, in DRC, in the US, there's places where there's just a greater uptake for girls and women's physicality, for their place in the public sphere, than it is in Iran. And then it is in Afghanistan. And so I very intentionally came to Free to Run to learn, I think, in many ways, like the last frontier, the hardest iterations in many ways. And of course, hard is relative in lots of different contexts. It's harder than in others. If you grow up with a lot of privilege in Saudi, you have a lot more access to sport as a young woman than a girl without privilege in the US, maybe. So I don't want to overgeneralize there, but watching what Free to Run has done over the past 11 years in Kandahar, the birthplace of the Taliban, creating intergenerational and it's like pipelines basically of women, girls who turn into women, young women who turn into women who have been running marathons, who have been playing sport, who have been teaching young ones to do the same and take up that space has just been an incredible learning for me. And it is the second part of that is it's necessary everywhere. There's no place in humanity where girls and women or anyone doesn't need to move their body and doesn't need to have access to that joy and resilience that I spoke about for myself. It's a fundamental human right. And so we have a program right now in Gaza, and there's a lot of criticism about doing sports programs for girls or physical activity programs in Gaza because there's food scarcity and basic needs. And so I agree that this shouldn't replace those things. Those are critical, just basic safety and security. But who is to say that girls who have experienced the trauma that they are experiencing right now in Gaza should not have access to a place where they can do mindful breathing, stretching, and strength exercises together and talk with one another. It is super low cost and it's really important for them right now. So yeah, it's possible everywhere and it's needed everywhere. And then I think the second thing that feels important to note in my own evolution, but definitely in my time with Free to Run, is that progress in this sphere is not linear. I wish it were. It would be a lot easier if it was. But in this moment in time, with the anti-gender backlash and the, rise of the far right, and what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Iran, I mean, 30 years ago, Iran, girls and women were free to do so much more than they are today. Is that there's a lot of backslide. And so just with reproductive rights or pay equity or any of the other issues that we as feminists are working on a daily basis, we have to hold the line and push progress and recognize that yeah, it's not linear, and so it requires constant persistence and resistance and attention in that. And I'll talk more, I think, later in our conversation today about Afghanistan and kind of an interesting case study of that. So, yeah, that's it from me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now I'll turn it over to Nicole. And my question is, what has been the impact of Women Win by engaging more women and girls in sports? And what are some of the spillover effects that you've seen for their communities?
Thanks so much, Danny and Emily and everyone for being here. Also super honored to have been invited. And also just really hard to go after Sarah. I don't know who came up with the order of Sarah speaking first, but I feel like she has absolutely said all the things that were in my mind. So now I'm scrambling to think of how to follow her. However, I would say from a Women Win perspective, and I guess I don't know how much everyone knows about Women Win, but we're, Free to Run, very much direct service provision and working kind of in specific regions, whereas Women Win is just a global women's fund. So we work around the world, really as an intermediary, as a funder, as a women's fund, and support programs like Free to Run and what Sarah is doing, as well as others in other countries, regions, and communities. And so I guess when I'm speaking here, I'll be really speaking from that perspective, as yeah, seeing kind of the macro picture a bit, and the role we have as yeah, a women's funder, a feminist funder in this space. But yeah, Women Win. I mean, we've been doing this since 2007, for a very long time, and I think you know at this point in time, after all these years of, not only us, but lots of people in this ecosystem kind of working on gender equity, gender justice in sport, getting more girls into sport around the world, especially with a rights-based kind of approach, I think the impact on girls and women, and to Sarah's point too, like when I say that, I'm not going to qualify it every time, but I mean kind of, yeah, gender diverse, gender expansive individuals is pretty well evidenced. Like we know the impact sport has on individuals. And I think Sarah too, as a testament to her story, her personal story, like, it brings so much to an individual. But I think for us at Women Win, another thing which is a bit, I think, alluded to in the second part of your question is the impact on communities that this has, and on kind of more yeah, macro issues around gender norms and stereotypes and the transformative power of watching girls and young women take space on a pitch, on a field somewhere, playing a sport, using their bodies to move physically in a space has a huge impact on that community. And obviously, yes, like some places, and Sarah can talk to this as well, like girls just can't do that right now. It's too dangerous and they need to do it inside places away from that public space. But in places where they can, I think this, we've seen at Women Win, like the impact that this has had on mothers, guardians, quote unquote gatekeepers in communities that kind of often are making decisions as to what girls can and can't do. I think seeing girls playing sports and seeing using their voices, speaking up, leaning into their leadership in these spaces has been transformative. We've have incredible examples of some of our partners, like in India, for example, where girls would come out in the organization, an incredible organization called Matriana, used to be the NAS Foundation, would host kind of community sports days, and all the mothers would come out and want to learn how to play netball, and you have the girls teaching their mothers and fathers and brothers how to play the sport. Um, or other places where, yeah, the community just really turns up and supports girls as programs get more embedded in a community. Like we've also seen the longer sports programs and projects exist in a community, the greater chance of the community, the norms there around gender, what girls can and can't do, really gets transformed through that. So I think, yeah, that's been kind of one of the places where, yeah, we really see not only on the individual level, but really the impact and the scale with which a sport program and girls just playing sport, not only for their own like joy and resistance, as Sarah alluded to quite a lot, but for also, yeah, community, the girls, also another impact, I would say, not only community level, but solidarity among girls. So there's a lot of places where girls don't have as regular access to education, which is another space where they could actually, come together in solidarity with other girls and talk and learn from each other. Oftentimes that, is harder for girls to access in certain communities. It's disrupted. It's sometimes not even allowed, where, and sport can kind of come in those spaces and be that, where yeah, girls can come together and talk to an older mentor, a woman coach, a female role model in their community. They can learn about their sexual and reproductive health and rights. They can get connected to service provision around different health related issues that maybe they might be too scared to go to on their own. But going together in a group as a football team to the local kind of health clinic actually brings them strength, and they're not, and an ability to do that versus just going as an individual. So I think there's also something about the network that girls and women can create in a sports program. And yeah, we've seen this especially through one of our participatory grant making shared governance funding mechanisms that's really supporting grassroots feminist organizing and sport, gender justice and sport. I would say this is probably like our most feminist, most kind of grassroots initiative, where it's just unrestricted funding for community organizations doing kind of the work at the intersection of gender justice, feminism, and sport. And here you really see the groups coming together in joy and solidarity. Some are doing outright advocacy in their communities as a group around certain women's rights issues, and others are just using it as a space to be with one another, and that, yeah, that joy is resistance kind of opportunity in doing that. So
Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you both for really highlighting how engaging more women and girls in sports can really break down those gender barriers, or this idea that sports are just for men and boys. Um, and also it's a space where you can build those bonds and solidarity between women and girls. And so, as I mentioned, WILPF is a feminist peace building organization, and we have a very large section in Afghanistan with many dear friends and colleagues who are based in Kabul or have had to flee. So, Sarah, if you could tell us more about the program. I know Free to Run was founded in 2014 in Afghanistan, and it continues to operate in Afghanistan. If you could share more about what your experience has been like for Free to Run since the Taliban takeover. How have you adapted to the conditions on the ground? And if you could also share more about what is happening in Gaza, how Free to Run has adapted to the conditions right now in Gaza, that would be really interesting for us, and also very important to center the experiences of women and girls in Afghanistan and Palestine right now.
okay. There we go. Unmute. Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And I just want to also acknowledge that there are two people on this call right now who were with Free to Run during some of the hardest times in Afghanistan. So Kim and Erica. So they also have a lot of firsthand experience. I came about 6 months after the Taliban takeover, and so I know a lot about what our recovery has looked like and the actual crux of the Taliban takeover. It wasn't there with the organization. I was actually working to kind of support some Afghan women athletes and mountaineers to try to get out of the country during that time in my last position. But yeah, so let's see. So Free to Run was kind of born in Afghanistan in many ways. In 2014, the organization was started by a feminist human rights attorney named Stephanie Case. She's a Canadian woman. She's also an ultra runner. And she basically was running and trying to raise money for women in Afghanistan, specifically gender-based violence shelters. And on the weekends, she was living in Kabul. She would go and run with around the compound in the UN. Then she'd go visit the shelters where she was trying to, give some support, and started to make relationships with some of the women there, and specifically young women. And they were like, "Well, thanks for raising money. Can we run with you?" And she was like challenged, like, Afghan women running. I don't know, let's see. And so she started eventually, challenging her own sense of what was possible and running with some young women in the UN compound, and then using her UN sensibility and all of the risk and safety kind of protocols to start expanding that space to other areas outside of Kabul, and saw that it was possible, depending on how you did it and where you did it. And actually, there's a huge kind of transgressive opening that could happen when girls are doing something that is so countercultural. And so, running, it's really not part of Afghan culture for people to run at all, but also so powerful in their bodies, and so sport being so masculine that, like, when you could create an opening in that domain, you have this kind of Trojan horse effect where you can open a lot that is haram or kind of outlawed for girls and women from a gender perspective in society. And so she like had this aha, and that's kind of how Free to Run was started. And then from there we grew into many other conflict countries, and but in Afghanistan specifically, for from the time of 2014 until the Taliban took over in 2021, the organization was growing, growing, growing in Afghanistan. So a grassroots sports program, thousands of young girls and young women, mostly focused on adolescents, in 5 different provinces, including Kandahar, Herat, Mazar, Kabul, Bamyan, and having girls basically do parallel rights-based programs. So learning about their sexual and reproductive health and rights, their leadership, their agency, employability skills, communication, all that kind of stuff once a week. And at the same time, running and progressive running with groups of girls. And I say running, running, walking, hiking. We make the barrier to entry very, very low. So it's not just like that doesn't, it's not just a hot slog for girls that is like not fun. You've got to make it fun. And doing that over time, and then progressing in their running to a 5K, a 10K. And ultimately, we had trained the first women to run marathons in Afghanistan, to do ultra marathons, to do triathlons. And the young women who had started the program in 2014 and 15 became the young leaders, became the paid staff, became the global ambassadors that were being covered in The Guardian and The Independent for being the first Afghan women to do these feats and to challenge gender roles in such a massive way. And so it really was this powerful example of how you can turn the dials of, gender equity in a society, and especially catching the wave of what was going on in Afghanistan at the time, which was a continual opening in education, in the workplace, in all kinds of domains in the economy. And so then, yeah, then the unthinkable kind of happened. And this is the most, radical backslide of gender and rights and women's rights and girls' rights I've ever seen in my life, where, one day girls and women are free to play sports outside. And now Afghanistan, after August 2021, it's no longer legal. You can get arrested for being a girl outside playing, or running or doing the things we did. And so it was incredibly tragic for the organization. We had about 50 different staff. Pretty much all of them had death threats in some way or were at high risk. The participants in the program, because they were aligned with an American NGO and because we were working on this progressive agenda, were all at risk. And so immediately the organization had to evacuate as many of our staff people as we can. So we chartered flights. It was a complete crisis situation. There's actually a film that the North Face, a short film called Free to Run, that the North Face produced about that moment in time and some of the young Afghan women who had to flee, and Steph Case and her kind of effort to be involved in that from a legal perspective and her own just ethical challenges around what was going on. But yeah, there was literally Taliban taking over our offices, boots on our desks. We had to burn all the paperwork. We had to smash the computers and get people out. And so we were successful in getting a couple dozen members of our staff, drivers, program folks, finance folks, admin people to the US and Canada to be resettled. There was a pretty significant contingent of young women who did not have passports. And so we helped them get, and a family member get to Pakistan. Some fled to Iran. And we supported them in their legal cases. We're still, all of the young women who were in Pakistan and Islamabad, the last one about 3 months ago got to the US with her sister, which was incredible and painful and terrible for them to live undocumented in Pakistan. It was just grueling. And there's still some people that worked with us that are, wanting to leave and don't have an avenue for asylum right now, and especially given the Trump administration and what's happening in the U.S. So Afghanistan, then what? So we had to pause our programs. Girls can't play sports. What are we going to do? There's the organization is falling apart. 80% of our funding is caught up in Afghanistan funders that have sanctioned and will no longer pay for programming there. Our money is frozen in the banks, which are now owned, like taken over by the Taliban. And it's like, can we even exist? The board is burned out. People are just absolutely at a loss, I think. And then the phoenix from the ashes, a group of young women, two of them, who are in Afghanistan, who were some of our young leaders in the program, are like bombing my email, and the former executive director, Taylor, who was really such a leader through so much of that. And we're like, hey, we're training 50 girls every day running in a basement. It's secret. We want to talk to you about it. And I was like, what? We had left behind some treadmills, and this couple of young women, they started using them and our old equipment, and were finding ways to keep people, girls and like young women moving, because it was such a terrible and hard time. And I was just blown away. And I was like, what can we do to support you? Because we didn't know if we could do programming and what might that look like. And so they basically were like, here's what we need. We need training. We can't remember what we're supposed to do. We need some resources when we can get them. We need some funds for trainers. And so there was a lot more to assessing the risks of what we could do. But we started a program called OMID, which means hope in Dari. And it's very much led by young women and their initiatives and the organizations, a lot of smaller feminist organizations that are working underground and getting groups of young women together. And initially in Afghanistan, it was okay to go, you could have an NGO. NGOs existed and women could go to work. And so we could go and do that in public spaces, or sorry, in NGO offices or schools or that kind of thing, where it was a bit like a community space. And then as things tightened and tightened with the, Ministry of the Propagation of Vice and Virtue, which is basically the ministry that sets these cultural boundaries around gender, as, now women cannot go to work, and now NGOs cannot exist. And, there's just so much to that. So then young women started to do this in their homes and in some schools that are like private schools and charter schools. And there's not one way. One of the things that I've learned of working these 3 years in Afghanistan is there's not one way that it is. It's a big country. It's a country without a lot of resources, and it's a country with a lot of variance in terms of the governance. So in some places in Kabul, of course, the Taliban has a huge presence. You could not just go out and walk in a park. In other places, like in Bamyan in the mountains, we have young women who are running multiple times a week in parks outside. And because there's just not much of a Taliban presence, and the communities over years and years, decades, have resisted the Taliban. And so it's a much more open place. And so, yeah, we have probably at this point 400 young women in Afghanistan that are leading small groups here and there. A lot of some doing running and walking, a lot doing what we call psychosomatic resilience work. So using body strength exercises, breathing to learn about different mental health techniques and trauma recovery in some ways and trauma response. So it's physical activity, but it's not the same kind of running that we once did because, yeah, I mean, it is different. We can't be in the public space, and the level of risk is incredibly high. And it's a constant dynamic of like, where can we be today? How can we be there? Where do we have to pause? What have we heard? And it's 100% driven by young Afghan women and what they see as possible in any given moment. And the role of Free to Run is really to listen to them, to support them, to resource them, which is different, I think, in the evolution of the organization. I think it was run more like a typical INGO and previously, which was fine. And that was part of the rapid growth and amazing in many ways. But this moment, I think, has had a bit of a silver lining in that it's really taught us as an organization how to be responsive to their needs and the leadership and at all levels and every moment in time of the young women who are part of the program. So, and that's transcended Afghanistan and has really taught us decolonizing and more feminist ways of working in other geographies. So, yeah, so that I think that's Afghanistan. And I just want to there's just one other piece that I want to bring up, kind of related to what Nicole was saying, but it's yes, it relates to Afghanistan and the amazing progress and change that happened there, and the fact that it is this, has been this huge black side, but it also is just maybe a global statement for folks that may or may not be so intimately involved with this work, is kind of like, why is sport powerful? And like I think one of the things is that it is this last bastion of masculinity. It's this place where it's okay to discriminate against girls and women. It's okay to be violent. It's okay to, be racist. Like it is acceptable in many ways to do those things. And so when you capture that, that's one factor. It's a big lever for change in many ways. But the other piece is that it's very, in some ways, it seems innocuous because it's just playing. Like, who cares about that in a way? I mean, not as much in Afghanistan, but it's like, okay, they're playing cricket, they're doing a thing, it's not serious. And it is actually really serious. And it's really serious because it's integrated into society. So sports are highly economic, big business. So and I don't mean just like girls participating in sport, I mean like sports media, I mean professional sport, I mean, Olympic sport, looking at sports on TV, all of that. Like sport is huge money. So it's an economic system. And there's a person named Judith Bruce that Nicole and I have worked with a lot who talks about guerrilla warfare with sports. So it's like it's part of that. It's part of our families. It's part of our cultural identity. It is part of like all of these aspects of culture and economics. And when we can shift those things in the politics of sport are huge. It gives us this really amazing opportunity to shift the dials of the economy, of education, of politics, and so forth. And so I just wanted to kind of surface that because I think I kind of missed it in my opening remarks. And it might, with all this talk about like, okay, girls just like going outside in Afghanistan and playing sport, that's great. Like the largesse maybe is missed of the global opportunity and the power of this lever. So I just wanted to highlight that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And that last point, I think, really hits the nail on the power of sports to really advance gender equality. For my next question for Nicole, I would like it's actually a really good follow-up to everything Sarah just said regarding anti-gender backlash and the increasing far-right extremism that we're seeing now everywhere in the world, but I mean, in the US, it's quite prevalent at the moment. Um, so how do you think sport can be a vehicle for facing these challenges and advancing gender equality and women's rights and girls' rights?
Such a great question. And I think Sarah set me up pretty nicely to kind of answer it. I think, yeah, it's, like to Sarah's point, sport is huge. It's, as she said, integrated into like the fabric of national identity even. I mean, just watching like the last Women's World Cup for football and now with the rugby Women's World Cup happening, like, the pride countries have in their sports teams is enormous, right? So it's like not only this big economic system, but it's also this big cultural system that's so important, and so I guess there's two things that women win as a kind of global actor in this space is seeing, on macro and micro levels is one is like, sport often it's like a chameleon. It like can kind of adapt and shift how it's used in different places and contexts and political environments and cultures, and one way we see it being used is a bit, and I think Sarah alluded to this, like, oh, it's just some girls or women playing sport. They're not doing anything important. They're not bothering us. Like, just leave them be. It's fine. Like, we're not even paying attention to it. And so it's kind of this like guerrilla warfare of like, women and girls, and gender diverse groups coming together because they really can't in any other context for maybe because of legal reasons, LGBTQI plus groups in Uganda, for example, or, other places where, just being who you are is illegal, like coming together on a sports pitch kind of acts as a bit of, as a way of being able to do that, and as a act of resistance in and of itself, but as just a place of mental health and well-being for yourself and your community and solidarity with one another. And and in places where, more kind of like women, like intentional women's rights work is happening and programs are happening and activism is happening, sport is sometimes not considered part of that. And therefore it's still a space where that can happen, right? In that way. And we've seen this, come up in different places in the Caucasus and the Cessna region as well, for trans groups and things like that, is like maybe they can't play, in public as much, but it's still a space where they can come together and not really be flagged as doing illegal women's rights work, right? And then in other places, it's like the center stage of, activism. And, I'm just thinking about the US now and the issue around trans women and trans girls being able to play sport, and in the women's and girls categories, right? And, this notion of sport being really built on these binary systems of girls and boys, women and men, and so sport being that place where these kind of larger conversations around equity and inclusion and identity are being played out, and therefore, not so guerrilla warfare. It's like straight out, in your face. And so, yeah, I think we've seen, and there's a spectrum in between. And I think as a funder, we've seen sport as a tool, as a space, as a methodology, as an approach. And I mean sport again too, in Sarah's sense around just sport, physical activity, moving your body and playing, just being used in really different ways depending on the context, the culture. I mean, you're looking now too in the kind of in the Gulf region, where, yeah, sport has typically, not been super accessible to girls and women, but now there is this race in some of these countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar, where, they're investing so much money in sport in general. And a lot of that is going into women's sport, because it's a sense of national pride, wanting to beat their neighbor in, their success on the sporting field or in investments into sport. And it's for them, it doesn't matter if it's women or men's sport, I think. And yeah, just the also increase in tournaments, in international tournaments for women and girls in sport, and the increase in size of those tournaments. So for, again, the Women's World Cup in football, the pool of teams that were included grew by, I don't know, maybe someone on this call knows how many additional teams were part of the tournament. National teams were part of the tournament in Australia. And that raises the profile, and I had spent quite a lot of time in Morocco after university, doing research and working in the women's football space. And women's football was barely anything then. This was back in like the, 2008s, 9s, 2010. Um, not considered serious, not, girls and women were often not allowed to play because it was considered, yeah, a men's sport, a boys' sport. They were going to get hurt. Nobody would marry them. You can think of all the reasons, right? And then the women's Moroccan national team was in the World Cup in the last World Cup in Australia. And all of a sudden I was in Morocco visiting family. And there were billboards in the biggest intersections of the biggest cities of Casablanca and Rabat and Tangier with the women's national team, plastered on those giant billboards being sponsored by the biggest telecom company in the country. Like you would have never imagined that, like, 5, 10 years ago. And so I think stories like that where, like yeah, there's this momentum, and we see it obviously in elite women's sports now too, but there is this momentum of sport, being that lever of change in places. And it's not equal and it's not linear, as Sarah mentioned. But I think it's happening in different ways. So
I love that story, Nicole. And you reminded me, as I mentioned, I'm from Mexico, and I was home recently, and I was talking to um, some women I met for my research, and they were telling me how because public transport can be very dangerous for women in Mexico, they started cycling, and so they created these cycling groups of women only and a lot of non-binary queer people as well, and they would ride together to commute to their work and to home, and sometimes they would ri go on these big rides together, and they talked about how it had been so important not only for their perception of safety, physical safety, but also mental health, well-being, and just feeling stronger, like physically stronger and mentally stronger, and more defiant of gender inequality in Mexico. So you also reminded me of that. But my last question for both of you, and maybe we can now do in the opposite order, so Nicole first and then Sarah. Um, what is your advice for young people who are passionate about feminist peace building, regarding sport and how they can leverage sport in their everyday to advance feminist peace? I think we are all in a moment of pause where we feel very powerless with everything that's going on in the world. So I personally find it very meaningful to be able to practice sport, to be part of WILPF and Free to Run as a Free to Run ambassador and be connected to those larger communities and, be supporting women and girls elsewhere. So, yeah, what is your advice?
yeah, great question. I think for at a personal level, like I would say there's no right or wrong way to do it, to practice sport and play and move your body. And I think oftentimes, like, especially people who didn't grow up, playing quote unquote like traditional sports or sports in general, like team sports or kind of more yeah, what's considered, a sport. It's intimidating to, run a marathon or even to run or join a team of some sort. But you can also just walk. I mean, you can, dance, like do yoga. Like there's so many, and I think Free to Run is a beautiful example of that expansive nature of moving our bodies and what that does to our mental health and confidence and just our individual lives, that it's just so important. And therefore there is just no wrong way to move your body, and do that in solidarity with others. And I grew up like just really intense, insane about sports. I played every sport. I loved every sport. I like ate and drank sports as my like sole being growing up. And I still love doing really intense sports where my, body just gets tired and I get sore, and that still brings me joy. However, I had some good friends who couldn't run anymore for injury reasons. I said because they're just old, but they would argue with me and say it's not because they're old, it's because they're hurt. And so we started walking. Like our group of friends was always, we were always doing like triathlons and marathons together. And when part of that group could only walk, really, we all started walking. And at first I thought, this is gonna, I'm gonna be so bored. I can't just walk. That's not sport. That's not moving my body. But after a couple of weeks of doing it, I was getting the same benefits and joy and solidarity with my friends and being able to talk and share things and do all the things that I loved doing with them as a group together by just walking and being outside and moving my body. So I think, yeah, my, I guess, recommendation or joy, like advice would be to start somewhere and just find what brings you happiness and joy and do it in solidarity with others and in connection with others if that's what you need and want. If not, sometimes the solo aspect of it is really important for your stage in life or where you are at in your life, and then do that and do it safely wherever you are. But yeah, my 2 cents. Sarah, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks. I so appreciate that. So I think I guess three. I love me a list. So let me give you three ideas of maybe how I think one is mainstream sport and play and the embodied experience in your feminist discourse. So I think especially in the earlier years when Nicole and I were kind of starting this work, there was and has been in the second wave of the women's movement in the Northern Hemisphere, there's been this reluctance of feminists to appreciate and uptake sports, often because these feminists did not have this experience in their lives. And so when you do experience it and you see the way your confidence changes or your ability to regulate your emotions or whatever, you when you have experienced it, you then get it from a political perspective of why it's important. And so I guess I would encourage you, those of you who get it today, to really help bring other feminists along in this understanding. And I think there's a really different, like Gen Z feminists have a really different understanding of this than, boomers and so forth. So, but mainstream it in your feminist discourse, that's one. Two is use it as a platform for your activism. Like it's there, it is a tool. One of my favorite examples of just the freaking cherry on top of feminist activists using sport was the 2018 World Cup. It was in Russia, and Vladimir Putin was in the stands at the final. It was France against Croatia. And a punk group snuck in, Pussy Riot snuck into that freaking stadium and invaded the pitch in the final, running crazy, like basically wrecking complete havoc, creating complete chaos in Russia, calling attention to Putin's basically authoritarian regime. And like, talk about a way of using a sport and a sport event. They're not, I don't know if they're athletes or not, but they use sport so intelligently. And yes, it landed them in prison for a long time. And they're legendary. I'm telling you the story right now. So find ways to use, in very radical ways or in innocuous ways, but like use sport as a platform for your activism. And then similar to what Nicole said, is just like claim it. This like play, go, this claim the space in your own way, with your own style, if that, whatever that means for you, and help others do that too. If you are looking for a way to help others do that, I've got my colleague Sophie Sandberg on this call right now, and Sophie leads our MOVE strategy. So basically, trying to build a global movement of people using running to address gender inequity in the world. We have a campaign right now called Together Stronger, and folks can, many of you are, a few of you are ambassadors for Free to Run. I see Laura on there. Like, you can raise money for Free to Run. Danny is actually running the Berlin Marathon as a supporter of Free to Run. So join us if you want to, for running, walking, hiking stuff, or someone else or a team. There's a really amazing organization that both Nicole and I worked with called Discover Football, that's based in Germany, that's got really strong young feminist activists using football and supporting other women around the world doing that. So yeah, just play.
Thank you so much for that really great advice. And I guess one of my key takeaways from this conversation is that um, competitiveness is really important in sport, but it doesn't have to be competitive all the time. And it is a way of claiming space, especially for women and girls. So thank you. Now I would like to open it up. If anyone else has any questions they would like to ask Sarah and Nicole, please unmute yourselves, or please just pop your question in the chat and I can read it for you if you can't unmute yourselves. And I'm very comfortable with uncomfortable silences, so I can just give you a minute to think about your question if you want. Okay, I won't force you to ask a question if, oh, Sarah,
Am I allowed to
or
ask a question of Nicole or of
yeah,
anyone in this group?
yeah,
Oh,
of course.
uh,
Absolutely.
all right, I will. Let me see. How do I put my hand down? Uh, I don't know. Well, anyhow, let's assume it's down here, lower hand. Okay. Um, so one of the things that I so appreciate about Women Win is that the organization and the leadership, Nicole included, are often looking at kind of like what's innovative, what's the next thing that is interesting, that is trending, that has energy, and how do we get behind it? The organization has really grown so much using that intuition and that insight and that more futuristic thinking. And so and I, sorry to put you on the spot, but I believe in you, Nicole. I'm curious, what do you see as the next frontier in this moment in 2025 and in the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years in this movement of feminism in sport? What is of interest and what is something that I think that folks in on this call might be interested to hear that we've talked a lot. I know I've talked a lot about retrospective aspects of this work and curious about what do you see as the next frontier? And that can be from feminist funding perspective, or that can be
Yeah.
from, just gender and sport trends, anything that comes to mind.
Um, Such a good question. And so appropriately timed because we are at the end of our 5-year strategic plan here at Women Win. And so we're having these conversations right now in terms of like understanding the landscape. How has it evolved over the course of Women Win being operating and what's the future? And I would say, um, so we're definitely seeing an increased interest in the women's rights feminist space around sport as a tool in feminist work and women's rights work. Like when we started, and Sarah knows this well because she was there at the beginning in starting things at Women Win, this was an uphill battle. Sport was seen like was just there was this like reservation and actual sorry, I'm losing my words today. There was this like repulsion towards sport as a strategy. Like there was, feminists thought it was still this bastion of patriarchy and this horrific space where there was no work for us to do or to use that as a tool. And fair enough, like sport has been built off of really like patriarchal norms and infrastructure, and that just keeps getting built upon and built upon because of just the amount of money in that space. And so, yeah, it was really hard. Like we were doing lots and lots of work to try to really influence, which is a lot of what Women Win tries to do as well, in addition to like funding and supporting and accompanying organizations, like really influence some of these sectors. And one of those was the women's rights feminist space. Like sport actually is a relevant, really good strategy for achieving like women's rights and feminist aims and values. And I think what we've seen is, and not just because of us, but because of all the incredible work of all the organizations like Free to Run, like all the organizations on the ground, people really, starting to demand sport in their communities and women's rights organizations starting to implement sports programs or use sport as a tool. Like we've just seen more funding unlocked for that. We were starting to see it now with just the decreasing in funding overall in the kind of women's rights feminist spaces because of just all the aid cuts and the chaos of this last year or so, I think that might change again, but I think there at least is an appetite. Like we're seeing, more conversations around sport as a strategy. We're seeing conversation around sport as a strategy for women's health in the women's health space, right? So not just in women's rights funding, but when layer on health or you layer on gender-based violence or economic resilience, we're starting to see sport seep in, as part of the conversation, right? So that's really exciting. And we're not the ones like initiating that, which is really exciting. Um, and then also I think you just can't deny it, but the massive growth of women's professional sport. Like that's another one that I think could be one of those levers of change, Sarah, that you talked about for unlocking, you know, what how we design sport and how girls and women access sport in general, because we know that when money, and there is a lot of talk around, oh, women's sport, like the leagues that are being built, the teams that are being invested in, investors want to do things differently. We want to build women's sports differently than than how the men's system was built and the men's professional spaces were built. And I think that's yet to be seen if that's going to be the case. But I think if so, that investment can really trickle down to like how are we investing in sport in the community at the community level and at the grassroots level, which, from a business case perspective is very important for elite sports because you need pipelines of athletes. You need, but then that money then will help unlock, I think, how much we can invest in grassroots sport leagues that give access to everyone, right? Not just those girls or women who are going to become elite professional athletes, but rather, build the base and an ability for any girl anywhere, any person anywhere to be able to access affordable opportunities to play and move their bodies. And so I think figuring out how to harness that, I think will be really important. And that'll take a system, a network, kind of, yeah, a strategy. And there's some really great organizations working on that as well in different sports, in different regions, et cetera, like Child Fund Rugby. Actually, there's some really incredible work happening around rugby right now and the growth of the grassroots game. And a colleague of ours that Sarah knows as well, very well as well, Megan Knight, like just doing really incredible work to create more gender equitable and empowering spaces through rugby, both at the very grassroots level all the way to the elite spaces. So yeah, I would say that would be my answer. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts.
It made me think that another way of promoting women in sports is by supporting, watching, going to women's games. Mexican football is huge, and women's teams have become more and more popular recently. So that's something that came to mind. And I had a chance to go to one of the matches, Australia versus France in Melbourne, which last a couple of years ago, which was amazing. So there's a question from Eva. So Eva says that she lives near Paris, and if you know of any activities that she might be able to join near Paris. If anyone has any thoughts or recommendations, not just Sarah and Nicole, but anyone else maybe in the group, you might want to connect with Eva. And
I'm happy to just so our campaigns. So if you like to run, walk, hike, bike, do something like that, they're global, and there people are connecting virtually. So feel free to look at Free to Run, and there's like an area about joining us. So if that's of interest to you, those kinds of sports and things or activities. But maybe, I don't know if Nicole knows there's definitely some NGOs that are working on gender in sport. I don't know, Sport dans la Ville, it's like maybe, I don't know if they're in Paris or not, or if there's other grassroots organizations that you could take a look at or, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Sports dans la Ville is a really big one, and I think yeah, they just built a really big complex in Paris that they launched at the Olympics. But I think they do really cool work, and there's a lot of like also volunteer opportunities I think there in terms of like just engaging and being part of that. I'm trying to think of what else in Paris. I mean, there's quite a lot from the Olympic legacy work, but I drawing a blank. But
oh, I
happy if
think
you I can.
Emily just shared a link too.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I mean, also like happy to share my email after this, and if anyone wants to reach out directly, I'm sure I can scrounge up some other thoughts.
Thank you. So any last questions? I see some people have had to drop off, but there's anything else anyone would like to ask, I just want to make the space, but okay. So otherwise, we'll just close the meeting. And I just really, really want to thank Nicole and Sarah for speaking today and sharing your stories and sharing more about your respective organizations. It was incredibly inspiring. I am a huge fan of both organizations and the work you do. And just to end our call, I just want to make sure that we center women and girls, especially, and of course, non-binary people, queer people, who are living under gender apartheid in Afghanistan and under the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Just make sure that we center the work around them and find ways to support them and keep the conversations ongoing around what's happening in those countries. So thank you once again, Sarah and Nicole. We will share this recording with you soon.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Yes, we'll share the recording and notes through everyone who registered. So for those who couldn't be it, they can have access to all the insights we learned today because there's a lot that we learned. So thank you so much.
Okay, bye.